Now to discuss the possible impact, such as, well, could have both on the learners and teachers. We're joined via Zoom by UKZN Dean and Head of School of Education, Prof.Thabo Msibi. Ngonyama, Siwela, welcome to SA Today. Let's start right there. I mean, how does a learner possibly even change the mindset? The question is to write or not to write. If I'm a parent of a grade 12 learner, they've been through everything this year with COVID, and now we are going back and saying, Lalela, get better, we have to go back.
So thank you so much for having me this afternoon. I think you're spot on, and part of the problem, of course, is that this has been a very, very difficult year for young people. They've had to cope with the impact of COVID-19 and having to really brave it out. Going to school, even though there were risks. And now, when they thought that they had completed that journey, all of a sudden they're being asked to go back again and to go back and write this examination. I must emphasize at this point that I think whilst it is going to be quite traumatic for the young people that are going to be writing these two papers, we must also appreciate the great difficulty that the Department of Basic Education was faced with in making this determination. I'm certain it was not actually an easy decision to make. The credibility of the papers that were leaked was in question. And I think that they had to act to safeguard the credibility of the examination and the integrity of the examination process.
And if we do take a pass one, pass all mentality, those students end up at your doorstep. You set papers at your level, and all of a sudden you can pick up that something went wrong somewhere down the line.
Absolutely, and that's why it was so critical, I think, in my opinion, that this very drastic and perhaps harsh decision had to be made. It's not just about passing Matric, but rather the after effects of having somebody who may not necessarily have been able to grasp all the concepts that are taught in the prior grades, and all of a sudden arriving in our doorsteps in higher education, or even in certain spaces, going out there in the labor and employment sector. We must also remember that when young people are writing an examination, at the end of the day, it's not just about South Africa. There are many of these young people who look outside our borders to try and also pursue higher education outside of South Africa. If there are questions about the integrity of the examination process, the papers, and even whether the students have mastered the concepts, it really puts a lot of questions to the country as a whole, the system as a whole. So I think that we must whilst it may be very traumatic, as SADTU has said, whilst there may be a great deal of anxiety, certainly on the part of young people who are going to be expected to rewrite these two papers, their own success, their future success, is tied to their ability to pass these papers, and for us as well as higher education, the higher education sector, to be satisfied that the students that are coming out of the basic education sector have actually mastered all the skills, the knowledge, and the competencies required to succeed.
August institutions of higher learning such as yourselves at UKZN see this just amongst your own students, where all of a sudden your degree is just about you up. You know that if listening from what you're saying now, if our students cannot handle it in Matric, when they get to that level where a PhD is had to be had, those stresses are much higher, because in a couple of years from where you are, then they got to the world, the real world, if I can call it that.
Absolutely, and that is exactly the point. We cannot shortchange society simply because we are concerned about the emotional aspects of what has transpired. Yes, it is difficult. Yes, it is going to require additional strength on the part of young people who are going to be writing this exam. And some of you will be aware, some of your viewers will be aware, some of us were questioning during COVID, or the start of COVID at least, whether we should be putting this pressure on young people to write these examinations. Now that they have written them, it is actually quite important that we are confident that credibility of the certificate that they will emerge out of Matric with is not in question, because ultimately we have to be satisfied that they have the concepts, the content, the competences required to succeed in the higher education space. And if somebody has cheated their way through Matric and they come to a university like ours, the expectation would still be that they have the content, knowledge, and they are able to succeed, because our task is effectively to build up on what they have learned in the prior grades and to sort of develop the range of areas of interest that they want to pursue. So, even though we do have foundational subjects that try and support young people when they come out of Matric, it would be inadequate for us to be able to support students if they actually have shortchanged the system by cheating in an examination, and we do not know the extent of that cheating. So I think that it's hard, it's difficult, but it's for the good of the system and for the good of the learners themselves.
Yeah. I'm just going to possibly maybe deviate slightly. I mean, earlier today, as we've been speaking about the possibility of matriculants having to rewrite, we've seen literally on our programs, a matriculant called in this morning on Morning Live and saying that he was so stressed about it. It's been a stressful year. He's now become depressed, threatening to take his life, for example. You heard matriculants on radio saying they just can't do this. They've had a tough year. They didn't sleep the nights they wrote those those two papers in particular, and how can they be pushed through that all over again? A parent says, we're coming to KZN for the weekend, since last year. This was the time to come down. Overall, throughout, whether it's a parent or the child, at the end of the day, you're saying, hey, Maluju.
You're asking very hard questions here, Tabi. So part of the problem, I think, just generally, as a general point, I'm very critical of the way in which we overemphasize Matric as the end-all and be-all for our young people. We know historically that some young people have lost their lives due to the pressure that we put on matriculants. Of course, the Department of Basic Education has introduced various mechanisms of trying to alleviate that pressure. But I do think that as a nation, we must come to a point of reflecting about whether this pressure that we put on young people in grade 12 is actually worth it. Are there other ways that we can reimagine a school exit level program, for example? Of course, we do a lot of this standardized examination because we want to make sure that we address issues of quality and consistency across the board. But at the same time, I do think that we can introduce different measures, different ways of handling this incredible pressure on young people. And many of us know that Matric doesn't define us. I mean, and if you were to go around across the world and ask people who wrote Matric as to whether that was the defining moment of their lives, many of us would say, actually, no. What happened post-Matric actually carved different paths for us. So I do think, as a separate point, it's important that we maybe pause for a moment as a country and really reflect on whether this pressure on young people is worth it. Now, coming back to the substantive question that you posed around, I've made plans, what do I do? I'm under pressure. I thought I'd done all that I could to pass this Matric. It's been a hard year. I think that those points are very valid. We absolutely appreciate, and as far as I'm concerned, that I think it's really, really a big ask to ask young people to go back and to do this rewrite. But I want to encourage young people to think of this as another opportunity being afforded to them to even do better than they would have done in the first attempt, to use this as an opportunity to showcase their skills and to not take it in a negative way as if it's actually pulling them back. Certainly, the pressure, as I've said, it's a lot of pressure to bear. But at the end of the day, they must be satisfied that when they get their certificate, it's a certificate that is credible and not in question, so that higher education institutions, employers, international institutions are able to say, this is credible, we can certainly accept this person, and we can build on what they know. The task of parents at this stage is to support our young children through this process, to help them navigate this very difficult demand that we've placed on their tables. Yes, if it means cancelling that vacation, let's cancel it so that we are able to support these young people to be successful at the end of the day.
You remind me of when I enrolled at UKZN for an LLB, ended up doing all the way around to a journalism diploma. Yeah, so it really doesn't define you, does it? Thank you very much there. There's Professor Thabo Msibi, UKZN Dean and Head of School of Education. Mabuya bengabuya isibonga kakhulu bafo.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, sir. Interesting conversation there. Now, the Agriculture, Land Reform and